the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is Saturday, August the 3rd, 2024. A few years ago, back in COVID times, which seem rather prehistoric now, Michael Lewis came out with what I thought was perhaps the best book on the first Trump era. It was called The Fifth Risk, Undoing Democracy. And it was about what Trump did to the American state. The Washington Post suggested that Lewis's book is a love letter to federal workers and a dig at Trump's willful ignorance towards the state and how it worked. As a kind of broader political science follow-up to Lewis's important book, there's a new book out by a couple of old friends of mine, Stephen E. Hanson and Jeffrey S. Kopstein, called The Assault on the State, which takes Lewis's argument in a broader sense, globalizes it, and I'm thrilled that both Hanson and Kopstein are joining us today. Steve, let's start with you. Are you familiar with Lewis's book?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we cited in our own, as you say, it's really the best account of the amazing attacks on just about every branch of the U.S. federal government under the first Trump administration. And one of our main themes is that it's going to be way worse in a second Trump administration.
Steve, I hope you're not telling us that there will be a second Trump administration.
No, we are hoping that our book makes whatever small contribution.
You may convince the 5 people who don't know who they're going to vote for about whether they should vote for Harris. The subtitle, Jeff, of Lewis's book is Undoing Democracy, The Fifth Risk. But in your new book, Assault on the State, you seem to be arguing that it's not just about democracy, it's about something else in this populist attack on the state, whether it's Trump or Putin or Bolsonaro or Boris Johnson. Explain the relationship between the assault on the state and what some people see as the assault on democracy.
Well, if you think about it, there is, first of all, thanks so much. It's great to see you again, and thanks for having us on. If you think about it, you can think about this in 2 dimensions. Most people argue that there is democracy and autocracy. And almost every Trump book out there says the big danger here is the threat to democracy. And we don't fully disagree with that at all. That is a threat. But there's a second threat, which is perhaps sort of not as visible, but Michael Lewis really was getting at, and we try to get at it much more thoroughly. And that is the distinction between good government, good governance, the things we want government to do, right? And really bad governance or personalistic governance, where the government is the plaything of the leader in power. And increasingly, when we were looking at Trump, and not just Trump, we saw a global phenomenon. That is, it's not simply how these guys come to power or whether they ever wish to give up power again, but what they do to the state when they take power. And calling it populism or authoritarianism doesn't really get at what they're doing when they come to power.
Steve, populism, of course, is a word that gets used a lot today, but you use another P word in your book, patrimonialism, as a warning about what's happening to the state. So, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to be suggesting in the book, The Assault on the State, it's not so much the functionality of the state that's being undermined. It's still, we'll get our water, we'll get our electricity. We may even get some defense and roads and schools and all the rest of it. But it's a return to a different kind of state, a patrimonial one. Perhaps you could explain that.
Yeah, happy to do so. It's a key concept for us. And actually, it came out of an article that Jeff and I wrote together called The Global Patrimonial Wave, which we published during the pandemic. And that's really the source of our book. So what we see is spreading as an alternative to the modern state is a kind of rule that the great sociologist Max Weber identified back in the turn of the 20th century. Very old, as you say, and it's basically the rule over the state as if it's a family business. The ruler feels free to treat the whole country as patrimony, to hand pieces of the state, all its assets, to the loyalist family members and cronies who do his bidding, and we use his because it is typically male. The gendered element is important here. It's patrimonialism. So machismo typically figures into this method of building state legitimacy. And as you say, patrimonial states can wield significant power. They did throughout most of human history. It's a lot more powerful than having anarchical situations or tribal confederations or the like. But the problem is governance, as Jeff was just saying, is typically incredibly poor. You have on and off provision of public goods. You may get your electricity, but perhaps you have a total incompetent person in charge of the electricity grid, but they're very close to the ruler. When Trump starts putting his cronies and family members in charge of important agencies and important diplomatic missions, you see the beginning of what we're headed toward.
Jeff, when I was reading the book, I thought, and I'm a big fan of the great movie, the Coppola movie, The Godfather. I know you've seen it many times too. There's that amazing moment at the beginning of Godfather 1 where Corleone, the original Godfather, I think he suggests it to an undertaker or a cake maker. They should trust him rather than the state. Is there a Godfather element to this assault on the state that you argue in your new book?
Absolutely. And to just highlight that scene, which I think you're completely correct, that it's very poignant. It is the Undertaker Buenasera, who's coming in on the day of his daughter's wedding. And he asks for a favor. The favor is that to get justice against the people who raped his daughter. And Don Corleone says back to him, why didn't you go to the state? Why didn't you go to the police? Right? After all, you never came to me before. You didn't show me any respect before. And he says, I did. And they went to prison. And all they got was suspended sentence. But I want justice. And Don Corleone said, yes, for justice, you came to Don Corleone. And I'll do this for you. But one day you're going to have to do a favor for me. And in that moment, Andrew, you're completely correct. And that moment captures the essence of patrimonial rule. That the rule is based not on, and he kisses the Godfather's ring, it's based not on the rule of law, not on the president as an office holder and the underling as the bureaucrat, but on friendship, on love, on respect, on personal characteristics and personal traits. And increasingly we find, and it's not just with Trump, we see that all the time with Trump, because all of us are sitting here bathed in American media culture. But if you know Russian, if you know French, if you know Portuguese, you see that exactly the same kind of discussion of rule by affection, rule by respect, rule by self-subordination is really at the core of all of this.
Steve, some people might have watched The Godfather and thought this patrimonial system is better than the state. Don Corleone decided on his own whim that these two boys who raped, or at least were supposed to have raped, the daughter of his cake maker, should be beaten but not killed. So they got, in a sense, excusing the pun, they're just desserts. Could one watch The Godfather and argue that the modern state doesn't do its business right, that it doesn't always enforce justice?
Yeah, this is exactly the appeal of patrimonial rule and the reason why the assault on the modern state is growing more powerful around the world. People definitely feel that they're not getting the kind of emotional responses that they'd like to feel the state could provide. And that's the source of the legitimacy of these kinds of alternative states. I mean, in the story, of course, Amerigo Buenasera, Amerigo is his first name, so he's essentially, a perfect symbol of Americanization. One of the reasons why he doesn't get the justice, quote unquote, that he feels he deserves is that the two boys who are accused are college kids, kind of waspy college kids. And the judge says, well, they've never committed a crime before, so they should get off easy this time. Maybe if they, repeat, something bad will happen. So this is the impersonal modern judicial regime. And people don't necessarily like it if they feel their particular case hasn't resulted in the sort of personal result they'd like to see. It's a totally understandable reaction. The problem is if you use it as a principle of state administration across the board, then every government agency becomes staffed with the loyalists, the people who accept a particular version of Don Corleone at the top. And again, you get the kind of arbitrariness and inefficiency and poor provision of public goods that we're going to see around the world if this continues.
And I would add one other thing to that. Andrew, you're quite correct. They were successful in getting Don Corleone to apply screws, to apply power. And patrimonial states are pretty good at that. But in the things that require fingers, not thumbs, right? That require subtle regulation. That's the kind of thing that patrimonial states are not very good at. And we're living in a world today that requires subtle regulation as opposed to consistent application of, or arbitrary application of force.
Jeff, I know you're a great scholar of Max Weber, the father of sociology, perhaps the most influential social scientist in history. Weber introduced the notion of disenchantment in much of his work, and it's perhaps the glue that holds together all his different analyses. Is this return to patrimonialism, is it a feature of Weberian disenchantment that the modern state is a mirror, a manifestation of that disenchantment? The rational legal system that operates it does away with blood and passion and loyalty. So is it almost an inevitable feature of disenchantment? And perhaps also it might not be so surprising that it's reappearing in the guise of early 21st century populism?
Well, it's true. The Weber uses the word disenchantment. That's a translation from the German Entzauberung, which is demagification. So the end of magic in the world, right? Of superstition. And in some way, Weber thought the creation of the modern state, if not inevitable, it was a logical condition of modernity. Because without the modern state, you couldn't have functioning markets, and you couldn't especially have powerful militaries. And both of those things were absolutely crucial. If you were going to have them, you needed to have the modern impersonal state, not based on the whims of the ruler and his followers. What Weber, although he doesn't really talk about it, there's an implication in there, and Steve knows a lot about this too, more than I do, is that it would be sticky. This outcome of the creation of the modern impersonal state, it would be a sticky outcome. And what Weber did not foresee is that somehow this magic, or the need for the good father, the patrimonial leader, that this would come back, that people would be so, and let's use the word disenchanted in a more conventional sense, people would be so disenchanted with the modern impersonal state, so alienated by it, so feeling that their needs were not being met, that they would run back to the Don Corleones or the Stalins or the Maos or even the Trujillos in our modern day. Right. So that's my quick and dirty take on. I'm sure Steve's even a great.
Yeah, I'm interested, Steve, in your take on it. And is it also possible to argue that, I'm not sure if this is the right word, the ideological consequence of disenchantment is the appearance of a technocratic elite, the very technocratic elite that the Trumps and the Putins of the world loathe so much and seem to be such a successful recipe for populist support?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things we're arguing in the book is that our old linear narrative that Jeff referred to, that the modernization process always goes forward, that more rational bureaucracies replace the personalistic regimes of the past, or that you have more rational capitalism instead of more personalistic forms of economic organization. All of that's wrong. There is no direction here in history. There is the technical superiority of modern states. They are better at military affairs, security, public policy. They're better at capitalism. But that doesn't mean that people will continue to follow those sorts of states forever if they deeply feel that they're not legitimate. And there's no.
Is China? Where does China fall into this? Because in a sense, they're trying. Going back to our cake metaphor, they're trying to have their cake and eat it in China, aren't they?
Well, China's still a Leninist regime, although with increasing patrimonial elements. We talk about it at the end of the book. So there is a phenomenon where Marxist-Leninist states, for all their tyranny and for all of their inefficiencies, are able to mobilize. They're able to create industrialization in a very rapid period of time because they have elements of state bureaucracy. Leninist states have parties and state agencies, which are actually staffed by experts. They're subordinated to the ideology and to the party's domination, but they still have expertise, education, and training. So it's an interesting thing that makes communist regimes actually more of a threat.
Well, the three of us were all taught by a very brilliant man at Berkeley, Ken Jowett, who had the very original argument that Marxism-Leninism comes out of a patrimonial culture, so that the two weren't really in opposition.
Precisely. And so there's a tendency in these regimes to go back to patrimonialism when the leader gets too strong. You see that with Ceausescu's Romania. You see that with North Korea. You have a whole dynasty. And in the case of Xi Jinping's China, there's an element now of that sort of personalization of a Leninist regime. So, the old tropes of Chinese empire have come back and are almost co-equal now with Marxism in the official rhetoric.
And I want to talk about Putin because he seems to be central in your argument after the break. But finally, Jeff, you talked about I talked about disenchantment for you, that translates into the end of magic. Isn't the magic of the modern state, Jeff, nationalism? And what I don't understand about the Trumps of the world is they are on the one hand nationalists, but also horrified by some aspects of the modern state. How do those two things go together? How can you be a nationalist and hostile to the state?
Well, in our book, we don't really take a firm stand on nationalism. You can have liberal nationalism. You can have nationalism which says, look, the world is divided up into these territories.
Liberals say you can have liberal nationalism. I'm not sure you really can, but that's another subject.
I believe you can, actually. But I mean, the world is divided. The organization of the world is that we have these territorial units. And within these territorial units, we have cultures. And the state is there to ensure that there is this national culture that we all basically swim in. We all learn English. In another country, they all learn German.
It's just a kind of form of magic, isn't it? It's what one sociologist famously called an imagined community.
It is an imagined community, but it is not. You don't necessarily have to believe that you're better than everybody else or anybody or other people can join this imagined community if they wish to, right? And so the modern state, it is, science itself, it's not simply the modern state, but the modern state is really, accepts science, accepts expertise, right? It has its own form of charisma, right? Its own form of magic where people
Another Weberian concept, of course.
Of course, right? That this is, it's very, very important. But once people stop believing in expertise, in science, in vaccines, then
in our technocracy.
Then we're in our technocracy. Then we're in a bit of trouble. There's always a balance, and I think this is where you're going with it, Andrew. There's always a balance between having a technocracy and expertise on the one hand, and democratic control over all of this on the other. And we're not against. We actually believe you have to have both of those things. If you don't have either of them, right, you're in big, big trouble. If you only have elections, then some people. That my favorite New Yorker cartoon, right, is where the guy stands up on the airplane and the passenger, and he looks at everybody else and says, who wants these elitist pilots to fly the plane? Let's fly it ourselves, right? Yeah. Well, if that's the democracy, well, I think we can live with a little less than that, right? But if it's only experts saying, you people, stop telling us what to do. We know what's best all the time under every circumstance. That's also a recipe for disaster. So we believe you have to have both of those things at work. In a way, the politics of our book are very boring, right? We're very boring liberal Democrats, not in the American Democrat sense, but in the sense that we want there to be both democracy and we want there to be a modern administrative state.
You're like the cake makers, Jeff. You want your cake and eat it. It's a fascinating argument. We're going to take a short break. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Steve Hanson and Jeff Copstein are brought to us because of our friends at Liberty's excellent new quarterly of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature, and then I want to come back and talk to Steve and Jeff about Putin and his central role in all this. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with two old friends of mine, Steve Hanson, Jeff Copstein, authors of a really intriguing new book, The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future. Steve, there's a new book that I'm sure you're familiar with by Anne Applebaum. She's a frequent guest on our show. I think it's called Autocracy, Inc. It's about the way in which all these autocracies around the world seem to be coordinating their assault on democracy. They may not agree on anything except the fact they don't like democracy. Putin is central in that, and Putin is central in your book. Is this assault on the state? You're both scholars of Russia. I think you both speak and read Russian. Is Putin the heart of this assault on the state?
Yeah, we argue yes. And there is some overlap with the Applebaum book, but the key difference is we are focused on the state and not on democracy. And we think that actually is a problem in some of the analyses. Here's the reason. Many of these kinds of people who like patrimonial style politics are really good at elections. I mean, Trump himself is a good example. He may win again, we'll see.
Well, he's lost some as well, Steve.
I know, I'm going down this depressing path. But the reality is that the opposition to elections is not necessarily at the core of this alliance, but opposition to technocracy, as you've said, and opposition to the modern state that is allied around the world to protect expertise and to defend our notions of the public good against patrimonial arbitrariness. That's very much the common denominator. I mean, when Orban goes to visit both Putin and Xi Jinping, and then Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and goes back to Brussels after that to report his findings, the focus there is on how the states of the world with rational legal authority need to be destroyed from within. That's clearly the goal. Now, you can portray that as a kind of religious calling. You can portray that as a return to greatness of the past. You can portray it as a kind of empire building. Putin started all of those things basically in the 2000s, well before the rest of the so-called populists took it over. So our view is that people don't understand exactly that Putin is the model for many of these people, not just an ally, but a person who really set the stage for what it looks like to build a patrimonial state in the 21st century.
Jeff, we've done lots of shows on what some people call the new Cold War. If there is a new Cold War, leaving China out of it, and it's driven by Putin, is this the ideology of the new Cold War, this assault on the state?
It's a great question. I think so. Well, you have to say, what does Putin want, right? What exactly does he want? There's been a lot of discussion. Is Putin rational, or is he like this great, realist power politic, right? And we think that sort of misses the point. The point that is what Putin really wants is two things. One is he wants to build a patrimonial state within Russia. But what about his foreign relations? What does Putin want with Ukraine? What does Putin want with Hungary? What does he want with the United States? Right? Now, it's less that he wants to actually pull the strings, right? I don't think that's what actually, and I don't think Steve believes that's what actually is going on at all. What he wants is a world of Putins. He wants a whole world of leaders who are like Putin's. And let's go back to Don Corleone. The image there
in the ring.
It's the meeting of the five families. sitting around the table. That's the image of international relations that he would like, where the big guys, the big boys, all get together and divvy up the territory, divvy up the loot, right? And that's the image for the future. And so, I mean, this idea, what Putin actually wants, right? Steve brought up his relations with Orban, but it was also, remember, his relations with, and also Orban's relations with Boris Johnson in Great Britain, and Boris Johnson's relationship with Trump in the United States, and of course Trump's relationship with Netanyahu in Israel. And this is all one part of a global phenomenon, right? That is spreading throughout the world. It is exemplified. It started in Russia, but it is not, let's say, controlled by Russia. We're not making that sort of argument at all.
Yeah, thinking of that and the male element, Steve, we did a show a few years ago with Ruth Ben-Ghiat, of course, very influential writer and thinker on authoritarianism. She makes Mussolini the heart of this in Italy, of course, as a supposedly populist right-wing leader called Giorgia Meloni. Are there women involved in this too, or is it really just a boys' club?
Yeah, so that book is a really important one. I mean, we would differ on a couple of things, just on the issue of the strongman book. Well, so fascism of the past was more ideological and more mobilizational than the current patrimonial wave. Those were regimes that actually did have visions of the future that they drummed into youth clubs and tried to get people out on the street to march in step. And the interesting thing about patrimonialism, particularly in Putin's case, is it's demobilizational. One reason you don't call the assault on Ukraine a war and call it instead a special military operation is you don't want to convey to the population that you have to sacrifice too much for this patrimonial regime. Now, of course, it inhibits recruitment and they still have to kill a lot of people and send them to Ukraine. But they consistently talk about this as if it's not about an ideology or mobilization or a future Russia that will somehow transform humanity. It's rather much more about loyalty to past results, past ideals, and of course, Putin himself. You know, on the question of women, which is really vital here, what's interesting is that in many cases, the kinds of people who take sort of far-right positions in European politics, who are female, like Meloni, like Le Pen, have older male figures in the background of it. Obviously, the father Le Pen, in the case of Le Pen, Mussolini himself as a figure in far-right Italian politics. And so that creates a kind of a mixed picture. I think it tends to make the female leaders of this ilk a little bit more pliable. We don't want to overstate the case, but Meloni's ability to support Brussels and, you know, be on board with Ukraine policy shows that there's a bit more adaptation than you might have had with somebody like Salvini, for example, in Italian politics, which much more staunchly.
Yeah, and again, it comes back, and maybe I've asked this question before on nationalism. Meloni, Le Pen, what they have in common is Orban, a hostility to immigration, particularly from North Africa and the Middle East, Muslim immigration. In traditional fascism, you had a strong state. Mussolini, the Arrow Cross in Hungary, the Iron Guard in Romania, the Nazis, of course, they all fetishized the state. So something weird has happened.
You know, it's interesting. In the case of Europe, in present-day Europe, the big critique of the current right-wing leaders is not necessarily against the state itself, right? Although that's there, but it's against Brussels. It's against the Brussels project. And what is the Brussels project? The Brussels project is nothing more, in many respects, especially in the new members in Eastern Europe. It's a state-building project. You second thousands of...
It's a multinational, but Jeff, it's also, and I wouldn't have voted for Brexit, but I think some of the arguments about a remote bureaucracy, an unfeeling bureaucracy, were actually rather correct, weren't they?
I think Steve's internet is a bit spotty, so let me just jump in there. They might have been on, but I think that the current polls coming out of Britain show that there's a lot of regret for Brexit because they were part of this. It's perhaps that the EU has never been explained correctly to people around because it is a complicated project. Like this,
that's a bit of an elitist thing, Jeff. If it was only, I mean, that's a Hillary Clinton kind of thing. If only it was explained properly, we'd all understand it and be all happy.
I don't know. I mean, you can call me Hillary Clinton. If that's the best you can do for criticisms, we'll leave it at that. But you know, I think that part of the problem is that, especially in the new member states, right? The EU was a state building project. They said, look, if you want to be part of us, the thing you need to do is you need to pass these 10,000 laws, these 88,000 pages of regulation into your national law. And that act, that really pissed off the Britons for many, many years, right? But that's the deal for being part of the EU. There has to be legal equality and there has to be procedures, everything ranging from the regulation of currency to the transportation of geese. It is a regulatory regime, right? That's set up all over Europe. And if you don't want to be part of it, then you don't get the benefits from it. And I think the Brits are starting to see the downside of all of this. Right?
Steve, let's come back to Putin. This week, of course, there was the hostage exchange. I don't know if it's the right word, hostage. Certainly exchange of people. And what Putin seems to be up to is getting spies and assassins back who he was personally connected with. It's very different from someone like Trump. I'm not sure if Trump has any association with spies or assassins, but if he did, I don't think he'd care about them, whether it's a Michael Cohen or any of his previous allies. He always seems to enjoy running them over. Is Putin, in a way, a better example, better in a moral sense of patrimonialism than Trump?
I'm afraid I was cutting out there, Andrew. We'll have to edit this part.
Jeff, maybe you can answer that one.
Why don't should I get out and try to come back in? Because it's just been...
In the first place, Trump was and is, today even still, right, bound by what is still a coherent American rule of law state, right? It has been frayed at the edges, and Trump did a lot to do that, to fray it at the edges, but it is still bound by what our colleagues Levitsky and Ziblatt at Harvard call
who have been on the show. Everyone's been on this show.
Everyone's been on that. We're the last.
But you're the best too.
You're the best, hopefully. Trump is still bound by the guardrails. What Putin did, Putin took a situation, right, after 1991 in which there was a decreasing state of any sort in Russia. There was no state and almost a situation of anarchy. And what Putin did is he reconstructed a patrimonial state from scratch. So he is truly unbound by the strictures of law, right? So you're correct that Trump may not have wanted, right, to go after this. And I believe that this was such a complicated deal that really Biden was the type to have pulled this off, a wheeler-dealer politician within the kind of set of kind of responsibilities for American civil servants and American citizens. But Putin wouldn't have needed to do this at all. What Putin wanted the guys who were loyal to Putin, right? That's who he wanted.
It's in the ring. Steve, how's your internet? You're able to?
I think I'm back. It sounds good.
Okay, you're back. The book that comes to mind in all this is Lord of the Rings. I'm not sure why. It's all about the kissing of the ring and loyalty. It's a very popular book, particularly on the West Coast, with people like Peter Thiel. You talk about him in the book. In Silicon Valley, there is an alternative to the modern state. It's called Web3. I'm not sure how familiar you guys, you're both professors of political science, but it's an attempt to use technology to turn the state into a network. What do you think of people like Thiel and their attempt to come up with technological alternatives to the modern state?
Well, we're very explicit in the book about this. Our view is that everywhere the assault on the modern state combines three strands. And one of the big ones is a libertarian strand, including the kind of big tech version of that. Visions like seasteading, which actually Thiel was involved in, along with the grandson of Milton Friedman, or the son. They have the idea that if the state gets too oppressive, you can dock your ship on whatever part of the ocean is open, and then you can move to a different place when that becomes oppressive again. These sort of fanciful visions that you can do without any bureaucracy.
Really having your cake and eat it, Steve, right?
Well, it's just completely utopian, right? I mean, some of it spins out fantasies of the singularity or living on other planets. And, for real people, the reality is public welfare and basic market regulation.
Yeah, but they would come back. I don't want to speak on behalf of Peter Thiel, but Andreessen, for example, who came out clearly in favor of Trump recently, suggested he was doing it because Trump was sympathetic to cryptocurrency. Network technologies like cryptocurrency do offer an alternative to the centralized financial authority of the state, don't they?
Oh, I mean, that's the vision, is that they would. Of course, in reality, and it's interesting to see Trump talk about a big hoard of U.S. bitcoins that he would.
Yeah, he spoke at a big crypto event last week.
He's figured out which direction to go for obvious money reasons. But, you know, in reality, those things require regulation if they're going to not mess up the entire global system. And this is the sort of distrust that's now emerged that the patrimonial leaders take advantage of. People assume that the state, the Fed, the conspiracy, right, is somehow pulling all these strings and that cryptocurrency will get them out of that. It won't. There'll still be a massive state apparatus behind any successful attempt at a cryptocurrency. And we see that as one of the strands. The Christian nationalist strand is there too, other religious nationalisms like Orthodoxy in Putin's Russia, or certain strands of Judaism under Netanyahu. That's always part of the mix because they hate the secular state for different reasons, overlapping, but different. And then there's a group of people who just think the state has to be effective with a strong executive at the core, the kind of unitary executive theory people, which you've seen behind a lot of recent US Supreme Court decisions. And our argument is that none of those people actually want patrimonial rule of the 19th century, but they end up allying with it because they have a common enemy. They see the patrimonial leader, the Trump or the Putin or the Netanyahu, as breaking apart the very state that they see as their mortal enemy.
Jeff, we talked about Max Weber, of course, very famous. His most famous book was Protestant Ethic and the Origins of Capitalism. Could one argue that there's a Protestant ethic also in the origins of the modern state, a form of self-control and ability to understand that you and your loved ones can't always be preferred over strangers?
Absolutely. And there's a self-restraint involved. Anybody who's ever been to, let's use the one that everybody hates the most, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, which we're not saying is the model for all of humanity. But when you're in
Fortunately, for those of us who have been to the DMV.
And you know, we are agnostic as to how much or how little state there should be. Reasonable people can disagree on that, right? But the point is that a critique of an existing inefficiency of the state should not lead you to say we can get rid of the state completely, because that, as Steve said, that does not lead to free markets. That does not lead to a flowering of freedom. That leads you directly. Do not stop, go. Do not collect $200 straight to patrimonialism, and that's what we're worried about. So. Your question was about the Protestant ethic and the kind of the origins and functioning of the modern state. Yes, the Protestant ethic said, look, what Protestantism unwittingly did is it told everybody, delay your gratification. Because in the end, if you act soberly and you get up in the morning and you act rationally and you take cold showers and you go to work and you work really hard, that will be a sign that things are going to go okay for you. Right? And
well, you'll be safe because we can't determine who will or won't be saved, but it gives you some sort of
absolutely confidence. But so too, like when you act within the modern state in the Department of Motor Vehicles, and you're very angry, you're standing in those lines. You have to sort of hold back your desire to say, everybody work faster, move faster. This is irrational.
Self-control.
And other better ways of organizing all this. And if you don't do it, I'm going to get really angry. And at that moment, if you allow your emotions, because you're the one who, if you allow your emotions to come to the fore, at that moment, you'll be tossed out of the Department of Motor Vehicles and you'll never get your license.
And that's, of course, the most tragic example of all this. People go into their local DMV and kill everyone. One more question, Steve, before we get to solutions. Jeff talked about law and the centrality of the role of law, but of course, law requires lawyers. How do lawyers fit into this? Are they one of the problems or the solutions, particularly in America, where there are too many lawyers and they have even less respect, it would seem, than politicians or state workers?
Well, of course, I'm married to a law professor, so maybe
I'm married to a lawyer. In fact, I've been married to 2 lawyers, so I know the law too well.
In general, I think people underestimate the importance of a professional legal stratum in a society for ensuring the rule of law. I mean, it sort of seems obvious when you say it, but it isn't so obvious to people because, again, a little like our Godfather example, people often encounter the judicial system when they're unhappy, and when they feel that they've been mistreated and they want a personal justice as opposed to something impersonal. So lawyers get a lot of bad press for that reason, because that's when you typically, or a lot of people encounter them under those circumstances. But the reality is, you got to have people write up all this legislation. If you want the people's will, even classic democratic theory, to be implemented as policy, you got to have a trained army of lawyers who figure out exactly how to phrase all this stuff, put it into writing, send it out to all the agencies so it can be implemented with some degree of transparency and repeatability. And this is one of the big problems with the Supreme Court decisions, like getting rid of Chevron deference, which is if you do that over and over again, you actually leave to lower courts the questions that bigger experts and larger judicial systems used to resolve for the whole society. It's a recipe for a kind of chaotic disintegration of rule of law into a bunch of local personal arrangements and deals. And that's actually part of the intent in some cases.
Return to feudalism. Your book ends with 4 solutions. I don't want to give away all the solutions because we want people to read the book, The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future. But Jeff, first, perhaps you might choose one of the solutions to talk about, and then we'll end with Steve with one other and leave the other 2 for people to read in the book.
Well, I think the one that I like the most is the idea of revalorizing careers within government, within the state. Right? It's been said for a long time now that the free market is more efficient than the state. You'll always get better service. Well, next time you lose your luggage, or you want to figure out your medical statement, right, or your banking statement, or you have questions about all of that, you go try to figure that out with the free market and the call center. I think while there's inefficiencies in the state, it's time to point the arrow in the other direction for a while. And I think if we can get our most talented people, or at least some of our most talented people, back committed to state service, what you can do for your country, to paraphrase John Kennedy, I think that would be really important.
So is that your way, Jeff, of volunteering to work at your local DMV in Los Angeles?
When I'm working for a public university. My entire career has been in public universities.
But in all seriousness, that requires people to be properly paid. One of the reasons why the DMV is such a dystopian experience is because the people who work there are so poorly paid, they just don't care.
Well, it's also an under-resourced project, same way with our airports, right? And the only solution to, let's say, our airports, for example, that's ever put out there is we have to privatize them and let these guys who are already very, very rich make even more money,
right?
Rather than sourcing them properly, rather than creating a proper public good. The whole notion of public goods has been kind of scraped away from our discourse. These are things that the market does not provide, but the market needs to function correctly. We need a DMV. We need proper functioning airports. It's not to say that every part of this experience is going to be wonderful. We're not proposing a utopia. We're proposing an appreciation of reality.
And so are you suggesting, Jeff, that one of the almost inevitable consequences of neoliberalism is this assault on the state, because it eats it from within by replacing most public services with privatized ones? So in the end, everyone thinks of the state as if it's the DMV.
Yes, exactly. You've put your finger on it, Andrew. That's exactly the point. It's not simply that neoliberalism eats away from it within. It delegitimizes. It takes away the value for all of us, because these institutions, they require resources. They require our commitment. We know what the alternatives are. This modern state arose for a reason. It rose for a reason because people viewed it as better than the arbitrary, personalistic rule of times past. And the problem is that there's really no alternative to it. As Steve said, these either libertarian or Christian national or belief in the kind of unfettered rule of the executive theories, they're not going to get us anywhere. They're just going to lead us straight back to the rule that we had before. And the point of our book is we've already seen a taste of it. And in order to get out of that, we have to appreciate, right, the achievements. What an amazing achievement the modern state actually is.
Steve, let's end with you. How do we try to make sure that we don't all end up in the DMV, or at least we make the DMV a better place?
Yeah, it's funny. Just incidentally, there was a column in the New York Times the other day by Lydia Polgreen saying, "Stop bashing the DMV. Everyone's doing their best there."
Well, that was a very New York Times kind of opinion piece.
Yeah,
Sure
just
was.
thought I'd mention it. So, look, we had a lot of things in the last chapter which we think will help. I want to focus on the foreign policy dimension because we end with that, and we think it's a bit new. So one of the things we point out is that patrimonial states are not only a threat to their own public goods and their own populations, they're also a threat in foreign policy. You certainly see that with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but you see it everywhere with patrimonialism from essentially the beginning of empires in Europe on to the present day, because empires typically see their role as undermining legal rational boundaries of states and enforcing notions of patrimony based on some fuzzy notions of history and even sacredness. So what you get there are overlapping claims by whether it's Erdogan or Putin or Netanyahu or Modi, any number of leaders who could say, look, our notion of the greatness of the past happens to overlap with what you think your greatness consisted of. We already saw that picture. It led to World War I. And that's happening as we break up institutions like NATO, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big statement, Steve. Maybe you can write your next book on that. Are you suggesting then that the key problems of the 21st century are global warming, of course, in particular, and that patrimonialism, by definition, compounds those problems?
Yes, and we mentioned global warming at the end of the book, that if we're going to have a solution to this terrible existential crisis, you've got to have global regulation, global agreements, global enforcement. And who's going to do that enforcement? It's going to be existing states that decide to do it together. The problem with the patrimonial alternative isn't just, if you accept or don't accept the potential for, global war over territory and patrimony, but for sure they undermine agreements of the legal sort needed to create public goods of a global sort, such as not frying our planet.
Well, and it's an important argument, very, very relevant argument, and good. Anyone who's read the Michael Lewis Fifth Risk book, I think it's a good follow-up book. The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future by Stephen Hanson, Jeffrey Kopstein, two old friends of mine. The book is out in the UK and the US. We'll have to get you back on the show, both of you, to talk more about this. It's an interesting question and one that's going to get, I think, played out in odd ways in the current election in America. So Jeff and Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us, Andrew. It was really a pleasure.
Great to see you.